passed. This is a gross conflict of interest. No question about it. And what puzzles me is why it took all these years to finally come to that conclusion. In that 2005 PAC bond council meetings, it was initiated in May 2nd of 2005. This council chamber was filled to the brim, principally with members of art communities who would have benefit from a performing arts center to be built. Many of them pushed into the council chambers by mail from the mayor. And there was a long line of support for the PAC bond, including Mr. Sharp and Mr. Carter, who were also on the CRC, who ultimately voted for that PAC bond. And yet, all of those people who were in favor of the bond, and this has to do also with the F&B tax ordinance that you have, because it's more subsidy for the Performing Arts Center. And by the way, I might add that I don't see any out as far as taxpayer money going to the PAC. Maybe if that project was still $80 million, maybe we would have a way to go. Maybe if there would have been donations and endowments collected all these years, maybe there would have been a way to go. But at this stage, I don't see any other way to go but resident taxpayer money, something, of course, the mayor promised all along, in fact, helped sell the project back in 2005 by saying that he was going to collect endowment money, which if that had happened, we wouldn't be talking about shelling out resident taxpayer money in our budget of $2 million. In that meeting, there was a wild number, in those three meetings, the wild number of support for the PAC, but certain people were generally ignored, and I'd like to just mention them briefly. One being Sandy Johnson, who said that this project shouldn't be built wholly with public funds, but principally with private funds. That didn't have any impact. Wayne Wilson, who was an ex-councilman at that point, who argued that it was a TIF shell game, that the mayor had previously promised in a 1998 bond that no resident taxpayer money would be used to pay that, and it ended up that half was paid by resident taxpayer money, and that there were no unbiased reports or studies. Now, when I say unbiased, typically the Carmel Council doesn't seem to want to hire their own independent individuals to counter any of the reports or analysis of the mayor's consultants. You have relied, not you, but the previous council as well, have relied on his consultants. There's never been a balance, and that's what the council should be doing. Balancing. That's part of your job. How you could even consider an $80 million Performing Arts Center bond, at the time the largest individual bond issue that Carmel ever had encountered in its history, without counter opinions. Mrs. Mills stood up and said, we voted for you as Republicans. Republicans are conservative. How could you even consider this issue? That had no impact. A fellow by the name of Jerry Hennesser also stood up several times, and I think I'm pronouncing his name right, to talk of that additional impact or input from the residents of Carmel were not necessary because whoever was in the hall was sufficient. Obviously, that showed that people were in favor of the Performing Arts Center. 20 days after the Performing Arts Center was passed, on May 31st, Mr. Hennesser was appointed to the Carmel Redevelopment Commission, as was Mr. Jeff Worrell, almost 1 year to the day, was also appointed to the CRC, and he had been very vigorous in his support for the PAC on behalf of the chamber. But there was one thing that really surprised me as Mr. Sharp and Mr. Carter were looking on, and that was a report by Sean Ryan, who was the cost analyst for the Performing Arts Center from Donnell Company. And in the course of his PowerPoint presentation to the council, there was a card that was entitled Wish List. And that wish list was documenting a meeting between the mayor and Mr. Ryan, for which he said of the original amount that the mayor was interested in spending for the Performing Arts Center, ultimately, he had to whittle it down, those were his words, down to the $80 million bond. What was the amount that the wish list started with? $164 million. Where do we stand now? But still, even though the fact that the bond was also backed by resident taxpayers, we had Mr. Sharp who stood up and offered a motion to not even send the bond issue to the Finance Committee. In fact, Mr. Sharp, in effect, wanted to have a special meeting to dispense with the issue rather than spend time going to a Finance Committee. And so when Mr. Kirby, the then president of the council, didn't want to hear of that, and there might be some people here who remember that, Mr. Sharp then, in effect, threatened Mr. Kirby that if he didn't do it, then he would go